Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the second episode of our hashtag WePlay2020 online series, inspiring girls in sport with proud support from all the gang at Kinetica and also at Sport Island. Today, we're bringing you the first of our 4 semi-live Q&As, and my guest is Sport Island Institute performance nutritionist Sharon Madigan. Sharon, first of all, where in the world are you right now, and how are you doing?
Hi, Jessica. Well, I'm currently on the outskirts of Belfast and it's a nice sunny day. And doing good. It's definitely a different way of working, but I suppose we have to take the positives from it, don't we? I have to say, I never thought I'd ever hear the day where I would miss the M1 from Belfast to Dublin and stopping off in Apple Green and stuff like that. But it's definitely, I might have forgotten how to drive actually by the time this is over. But anyway.
There's many things we have to consider, like forgetting how to drive. A lot of us at Swim Island are worried we might have forgotten how to swim. Forgetting how to go outside, really. But when we do go outside, we might be needing your help. So we will move on to the Q&A, which we have promised everybody who watched your talk yesterday. Now, the We Play Inspiring Girls in Sport conference is focused on doing just that. So when Sharon spoke to us in episode 1, it was with a focus on the role the menstrual cycle plays in a female athlete's performance. If you haven't watched it, there's a link in this post to do so. But for those who have, some key questions arose. So the first one we'll go to, Sharon, is from Kevin Kelly. I know you've seen some of his questions. Now he asks, Sharon, for example, if you have a tall volleyball player who is underweight according to BMI, but is performing well, has a normal menstrual cycle with good sleep and energy pattern, do you accept her underweight BMI as a flawed indicator? I guess this question, Sharon, is about BMI. Do we trust that? Is it a good indicator of health?
I think for the general population, it's one of the better ones that we can use. Is probably the only one we can use in terms of getting population-wide statistics. I think when it comes to individuals, particularly athletes, it's tricky, and I would say that it's probably not accurate all the time. It's certainly when you talk about larger, more muscular individuals, it's certainly not an appropriate measure. In terms of tall, lanky, lean individuals, it is important. I think what Kevin has said is very right. You're looking at other indicators of health in there as well. So there's good menstrual function, good energy levels, and sleeping well. So I think they're very important. I think what you have to potentially remember is that somebody who's very tall and is competing actually will have quite a high energy requirements, particularly around, let's say, training or competition. So making sure that the volume of food reflects that is really, really important, Kevin. I think what you have to remember as well is that sometimes training hard can have a significant impact on appetite. So actually for a period of time, potentially around or after training, athletes may not actually feel like eating quite a lot. So that can have a knock-on effect on potentially weight in terms of somebody being very lean. So I think other indicators that I would use as well is, are the athletes susceptible to picking up colds or flus? Are they getting sick a wee bit more frequently than they should do? But if that's okay, then I think this individual, that's genetically just the way they are, and I would take it as that. Maybe occasionally, think about maybe getting some bloods done, particularly with relevance to iron status as well.
Yeah, that's all interesting stuff. And as you mentioned, your body composition, it can play a part in your BMI. Exceptionally tall people in this example, or small people, or very muscular people. It's all very different. So another question then from Kevin is, what is the best way for a female athlete to calculate her required daily calories for maintaining weight?
Yeah, again, it's tricky because I think that should be definitely driven by how much activity that is being done. So if there's a lot of activity happening over the course of, and we have to take non-training activities in there as well. So, if you walk the dog, if you walk to school, if you cycle, if you're doing all of these non-training activities, we need to take that into consideration as well, because they can have a big impact on the overall energy requirements. We talked about, I think we talked about this in the session yesterday, where we would calculate somewhere in the region of 40 plus calories per kilogram of lean muscle mass. Most of us can't do that. So I think a good starting point is looking at maybe that overall in terms of your calories, and then adding in, what the cost is for the activity that you're doing as well. But it's really very important, I think, to look at making sure there's no big gaps, particularly around the training, so that you can refuel quite quickly afterwards, because one of the problems is that you want to recover so that you're able to get consistency in the training that you're doing, but that recovery also includes putting back fuel into some of those underlying physiological systems, like, for example, your immune system. So you want to make sure that there's enough available for that, and that those systems don't run short as well. So I think age is also a factor. We probably didn't account for that. So younger athletes proportionately probably have higher energy requirements as well. So I would start with there. Some of the, some of the online food diary apps, for want of a better word, can allow you to calculate roughly where you're at, and then add in your training on top of that, and they can sync quite nicely with some of the, maybe the activity watches or whatever. So that might be a useful way of somebody, doing that maybe for a week, maybe spot checking it through a period of time where there's periods of higher intensity exercise or volume of training versus lower periods of time as well. I sometimes get concerned with some of the measurements, for example, the diary measurements, because people can get a little bit addicted to it, or they can become very maybe overly focused on it. So I think so long as that's not happening, they can be very useful, because I think sometimes people may not recognize how much activity they are doing as well.
When you talk about these diet trackers, is there any in particular that you recommend to people?
One of the ones that I would use, and I think there's loads of them out there. I tend to use something like MyFitnessPal, because I think it has got a good database of foods available to it, and it has a simple method that you can scan things in as well, which makes it less onerous on the individual keeping it. And also, I tend to it's not stalking, but I would have some of my athletes as friends on that, and then I can check in and out every now and again on that as well. I am conscious that some people, particularly a lot of athletes who are very focused on a task, can get maybe overly focused on it. So use it where it's necessary. And again, sometimes it's just to check on a really particularly high load day how much actually you do need to eat sometimes on those days, which can be actually, enlightening for some people at times as well.
Yeah, for sure. Along the same lines, do you ever recommend to coaches or female athletes to use period tracker apps?
Yeah, they can do that, or they can just keep a simple diary. I think the key thing is to know, I suppose, when your menstrual cycle is due, and more importantly, has there been any changes in that menstrual cycle? Basically, so has this menstrual cycle moved out in terms of days between each menstrual period, or has it got particularly light as well? That's important to look at that as well. So I think it's really important. You can do that, just circle in your diary, or I think you can circle it now in your diaries on your phones. So there doesn't, for me, they're all effectively doing the same thing. the key thing is that people are doing it. Because you can actually track, if somebody has, let's say, for example, gone from a regular 28 or a 30-day cycle out to, let's say, 45 days or 50 days, that allows me then to track back and say, well, was there significant increase in your training load, in the last 3 months? And more often than not, an athlete will be able to say, yes, there was.
And Sharon, you did speak at length about nutrition during the menstrual cycle in your WePlay talk, but can you give examples again of what kind of changes should be made to your intake during the different phases?
Well, I think one of the things that athletes and females would really, they struggle sometimes at certain phases where they feel that they're bloated. They feel that they're craving foods, particularly sweet foods. I think that's one of the ones that tends to come up more often than not. Chocolate, I think, tends to be the number one mentioned one. That tends to happen in the luteal phase, which is towards the end of the cycle, just in the lead up to menstruation. And that's kind of the changes where there is an increase in progesterone and a dip in estrogen. One of the reasons that could happen is there is sometimes an increase in core body temperature. That can sometimes have an effect on the quality and the amount of sleep that people can get. And again, it's really well known that sleep can affect our ability to, I suppose, we're much more tired, and our choices or our resolve to make better choices sometimes is not as good if we're tired. So I think being prepared for that is important as well. I think looking at hydration and making sure that you're well, have plenty of fluids on board because of that slight increase in core temperature as well can help a little bit. And I think in terms of cravings, if people are feeling hungry, they're going to go to the go-to place. So it's really important that you've got good structure, you don't skip meals, and maybe looking at increasing things like fiber in the diet, which fills you up much better. That could be increases in protein as well, which is a good nutrient for filling people up. And again, that comes back to behaviors as well. If you feel full, you're less likely to reach for the first thing that comes to mind as well. And again, if you're tired, you're more likely to, I suppose, go for the less healthy options.
The easy option, the thing that comes to hand, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think tiredness does make a big, and what sometimes I think it's interesting as well with athletes is that there's this idea that what tends to sometimes happen as well is not just in athletes, it's across the population, that they maybe don't eat enough earlier in the day when they are actually training. And then by the time evening comes, they actually are quite hungry. And again, that combined with tiredness, again, your choice making processes are maybe not as good as they would do. So for example, I give the example sometimes for me, I travel up and down to Dublin all the time. So I always stop in Applegreen in the morning because I'm less likely to make poor choices if I go in and get fuel in the evening time and there's all these chocolate bars jumping out at you. So again, I think eating earlier in the day and really fueling around your training is really important because you will be less tired as well. And I think have a look at sometimes adapting your eating habits. So we go with that usual scenario where we have breakfast, lunch and dinner. It may be that if you have actually a really hard training session in the evening, it might be easier to flip the biggest meal of the day to earlier in the day as well, where it's actually going to be of use to you. And also you're going to be less tired in the evening as well.
So I've got a couple more questions, in fact, around that area that you just finished on. A question that came from our own Beth was, how do we get enough energy when nerves mean we can't eat? So this is sort of around an event and we're quite nervous, but how do I need to get energy in, but I don't feel like eating, so I'm not hungry.
Yeah. So nerves slows down digestion. So it can, so you're not going to, you may feel nauseous as well. Again, there's some of those feelings there. And also, I think some people are worried in that their guts might not be as good during competition, or particularly competition as they might be. So all of those things are kind of factoring into a perfect storm of not really wanting to eat very much. So I think you can do a couple of things. Look at the day before as being very important. So it's almost like a pre-fuel day, where you may take on a little bit more, particularly if you're competing early in the day anyway. That would be essential. And then I think you need to look at a fluid option. So it's almost like a meal replacement in a liquid format. So, I would look to, it could be smoothies, it could be oats mixed in there, it could be yogurts, and blended up and made into what effectively is a meal, but it's in liquid format. So I would use that alongside making sure that you use very small amounts of foods rather than looking to eat relatively big amounts of food. So again, trying to maybe introduce that at least one opportunity in the week or fortnight where you might practice those kind of strategies in training, so that you can then bring that through into a competition as well. So little and often is very important. Watch fibre intake, because again, fibre is great in that it fills you up, but you're less likely to want to eat to meet your requirements for that day. And also it is harder to digest. So you really want things that are lower in fibre and potentially lower in fat as well, because they take a lot more effort in terms of your guts as well. Keep it nice and light, keep it simple. And again, that's where practice and some of this in training is useful, because from I suppose a thought process, you know how it feels, you know what it's going to feel like. And again, that tends to, I suppose, make people a wee bit more confident in what they're doing.
Now, Beth, who gave us that question, her event is swimming. It lasts a couple of minutes. She doesn't have to fuel up during it. She's just fueling up to do it and then afterwards to recover. But you mentioned practicing your fueling. What happens when your event is an Ironman, say? How do you practice that kind of fueling?
Oh, that does require a good bit of practice. But again, because you should actually see the benefits of that during the training session itself as well, because they generally are quite long. So we probably have enough, particularly carbohydrate stores, to last us about 60 minutes. So if you're going at a lower and slower pace, you will be using up some of your fat stores, but you will need carbohydrate there as well. And again, that's important that we don't go excessively low on our carbohydrate intakes, because that can increase the length of recovery time, and also you're not going to get as much out of your training. So taking on board some fuel during, let's say, for example, Ironman or triathlon or marathon running is really, really important. There tends to be lots of options out there, gels, some people make energy balls or whatever, but they tend to be quite sweet, and sometimes they're tricky to manage as well. People don't like them. So I think it's important to mix it up a wee bit. Savory is quite useful. And some people, I've found that a useful one actually is potato bread. I don't know, that might be a very northern thing, but that's a useful way. It's easily carried around. You can toast it before you head out and then cut it up into a couple of squares, put it in some tin foil, and away you go. So look at some savory options as well. And again, in the heat, it's going to be really important that you relook at your fluid intake, because if you're dehydrated, you will use up much more carbohydrate, and then that can link then to things like cramping, which is, very much linked to fatigue and tiredness as well. So practice, Don't be saying, oh, well, I'm only out for, an hour and a half, so I don't really need to fuel in that. I think it's really important that we do think about that then session having a knock-on effect on the next session as well. So I think it's really important a lot of athletes look at either a day or a session and say, oh, that wasn't really that hard, or I didn't really train that much, so I'm not going to eat as much today. I really think it's very important not to do that. You need to look at the week as a whole, rather than just individual sessions, because people will run into trouble that way, and you will not get as good consistency in your training as you would do if you actually see that non-training day or rest day as an active recovery day. And just like we talked about the racing day or competition day as being virtually impossible to get all that you need in on that day, well, that rest day allows you to be flexible and to try and match the requirements for the week in there.
So when we're looking at coming up to an event, a lot of what we're speaking about at WePlay is about female athletes. And when you're coming up to an event, and I've taken your advice and I'm tracking my period, and I know 5, 6, 7, let's say 8 weeks out, I know that at that event, that big event, it's going to be during my period. What can I do to minimize the impact?
That's a very good question and tricky enough. I think you need to look at what some of your symptoms are going to be. I think one of the simplest things is a lot of people may, let's say, for example, have pain. Don't wait until that starts to try and deal with it. And it may be that you need to have a chat with, your doctor around the management of that. I think it's important to look at, again, bloating might be something that's an issue. Some people find that, again, watching salt intake and stuff like that might have an impact. But I think for me, it's making sure that you have your plan in place. There are some things that you can look to do, but I would certainly look at speaking with your medical practitioner around dealing with those if they're significant and you know that they're going to be really tricky to manage. It used to be, and maybe is still commonplace, that girls will be put on the pill to manage that. I don't think that that's a good option long term, because it's certainly it's not the way to go from a long term health point of view, particularly where we're looking to use your menstrual cycle to monitor, let's say, whether you're eating enough. And if you take that away by going on the pill, then I think you're doing yourself a disservice as well. And I think from a bone health point of view, we need to look to the fact that estrogen and progesterone they maintain and look after bone. So we don't want to be taking that away by putting people on a contraceptive pill. So it's certainly something to look at, and it's certainly, you may need to look to speak to a sports physician about it, or, even look, if it is troublesome and a problem, I wouldn't wait to then. I would proactively look to dealing with it in the longer term, because it's not going to just happen once off. It's going to be a regular thing. So it's really important to look into management of that in the longer term as well.
If you have, so a lot of what you're saying there is if you do have quite strong symptoms, if you only have small basic symptoms, and it's not too much an issue, but you'd like to do the best you can. Is there just simple nutrition that you can take in, different types of nutrition that you can take in that would help you to overcome those?
We're currently doing a research project at the moment where we're looking at the effects of omega-3 fatty acids on PMS symptoms. So it may be for some, the increasing your omega-3 fatty acids might be a way to help manage those symptoms. So again, the rationale behind that is that some of the symptoms are caused by increases in inflammation. And omega-3 fatty acids help to reduce inflammation. So for some people, that might be a way of doing that. So that could be either through taking, omega-3 fatty acids, or increasing the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in your diet through your oily fish, through some of your nuts and seeds, and those types of foods that are higher in omega-3 fatty acids. But they also bring other benefits as well. So again, you're getting I suppose that kind of polynutrition benefit where lots of people might pick out one food as, a superfood over another one, when in fact the benefits might be the whole thing as big picture. That's where something like the Mediterranean diet, really shows its benefits. It's not just increased fruit and vegetables, but it's how the whole thing goes together, making sure there's plenty of colour with fruit and vegetables, because again, they have antioxidant benefits and may help some of those longer term health benefits as well.
I think there's a lot of benefits to living in the Mediterranean, not least the sunshine as well, I'd say, Sharon.
Absolutely. And I think, we're seeing potentially, we don't get a lot of sun in this part of the world. And again, it's important for things like vitamin D particularly. And, there may be some benefits in terms of, obviously with bones, it works with calcium for stronger bones, but there may also be benefits in terms of muscle strength and immunity as well. So I think vitamin D, certainly it could be factors like that in the Mediterranean that certainly is looking at their longevity and health and life too.
Just while we've nipped on to vitamin D, can you explain how we absorb it, how we get it? Do I just go out and walk around in the sun for a while?
Yeah, basically it's generated by the skin. Probably the advice would be 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight around about midday. Now, it is the sunlight around June, July, August that does generate the most vitamin D. The thing about it is it's a fat-soluble vitamin, so it is stored in the liver. So the aim is that we would generate and store enough vitamin D during those summer months that would last us through the winter. That's debatable or not whether we can do that. So there is some advice in terms of public health advice around supplementing with vitamin D through the winter months. So I think that a lot of people come January, their vitamin D stores might be quite low at that stage, so that it might be warranted. And certainly I think if you've got athletes that are maybe training and competing indoors quite a bit, they may be at higher risk of getting less vitamin D, let's say, than athletes that are out running around in the sunshine all the time. Wherever it is, the sunshine, although we can't complain at the moment.
No, not at the moment. It is actually, it's not doing too badly. And down here as well, I'm down in Dublin and you're up in Belfast. We're both getting pretty similar weather. I don't have too many questions left for you, Sharon, but one I wanted to is very specific. It goes back to bone health, I think. It comes from Pablo Sanchez, who says, who asks, what can you suggest for someone who has recurrent bone edema injuries?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple of things. Pablo, I would say that if you're having recurrent injuries, you really might want to have a look at your overall bone health. That might be a primary focus. So something like a DEXA scan would be really important to see what your bone density is like, to see that there's not anything majorly underlying there. I think from a bone health point of view, calcium and vitamin D is very, very important. So we need to ensure that we're consuming enough of that on a very regular basis. And I think from a point of view of fueling, we would see that bony injuries are something that are issues for athletes that are not fueling enough or sufficiently around the training load. So that's very important. So again, it's looking at are you consuming enough energy and you're not in energy deficit? And I think another really important factor is looking at how that energy is distributed over the course of the day and making sure that there's not long gaps through the day for, I suppose, again, it comes back to those physiological processes that are going on underneath the level of the skin. There's also some evidence to suggest that calcium might be lost in sweat. So making sure that you are consuming calcium-rich foods around training might help, I suppose, negate any losses that you might have, so that you come out of the session cost neutral when it comes to calcium. But also, when you're consuming those around your training, you're also putting in fuel at the time you're training as well. So I think you can, it's, I suppose, killing a couple of birds with one stone. You're doing 2 or 3 different things. You're not letting the tank go completely empty, and you're also making sure that there's calcium going in around that training session, so that if there are any excessive losses in sweat, that it's not going down to the level of the bone to have to replace that calcium as well.
So for our last question, as you know, the WePlay Inspiring Girls in Sport conference is about young athletes. But so one question that wouldn't have come up when you actually gave your talk at WePlay was about menopausal women. Is there any advice you could give to menopausal women who are active, who are still competing in amateur sports?
So very good question. I think there's 2 things that comes to mind certainly straight away. So we talked about estrogen and progesterone being really important hormones. Well, one of the key things that it does is it protects bone. It actually is really, really crucial for protecting bone. Once estrogen and progesterone starts to dip, either in perimenopausal females or drops completely into the menopause, then we don't have that protection. So it's really crucial that we are consuming calcium-containing foods on a relatively regular basis. Now, I cannot stress how important it is that we really have to be doing that every single day, and we have to look at where we're getting our calcium from. So in this part of the world, dairy is a big factor in terms of our calcium sources, but for some people it's not part of their diet. Either it doesn't agree with them, or they've decided that they want to exclude it. It's really important that if you look at your alternatives to dairy, be it soya, almond, nut, any of the nut milks, etc., they're not really like for like. So if you're using that as a replacement, either for calcium or for other nutrients, like, for example, protein, you've got to be making sure that you're getting calcium from other sources as well. So we can get it from other foods. For example, one of the top sources of calcium in our diet as well is actually fortified flour, white flour. So there will be calcium coming from bread type foods as well. But if you exclude gluten or bread, we need to be very, very careful that, again, you're looking at calcium. So it may mean that you may need a supplement, but dietary sources also bring other benefits as well. So that would be one thing, calcium and vitamin D for bone health, and making sure that we're looking to look after our bones in the short, medium and long term. The second thing is that one of the negative effects of having a period is that females are much more prone to iron deficiency anemia because they're losing iron on a relatively regular basis. But when that stops, then that tends to be less of a problem. So and that also, along with the fact that estrogen and progesterone is not there, because that's protective for females as well. So heart disease, so therefore we need to look at making sure that there's lots of fruit and vegetables in the diet. Our oily fish is really important. And again, we're not gaining weight into menopause as well, which unfortunately is a side effect of lower estrogen. Estrogen really is the elixir of life, isn't it? But it does start to have an effect then in body shape and body composition as well. So heart disease and bone health are the 2 key things that I would be looking to protect, and diet obviously can play a big role there in terms of making sure that we're consuming our good oils or good fats. And again, that's where oily fish, nuts, seeds, they do play a big role, and that we're consuming our calcium containing foods as well, so that we're protecting our bones.
So it seems like there's a lot of pluses and minuses for menopausal athletes, female athletes who are in the menopause. But is it possible that you could, as a female athlete going into those years, you could actually improve, you could get better for being in menopause?
I think if you look at some of, endurance athletes, a lot of athletes improve with time. So, there's no reason to believe that, it's not going to have a negative effect on you. So I think, again, it's making sure that you are eating to sustain what you're actually trying to do, because that will make sure that you're actually able to develop and maintain lean mass as well. Because if you don't eat enough for your training load, then the likelihood is that some of that lean mass will be used to fuel your training on a daily basis. So it's very, very important that we do eat enough, and I suppose not eat too much there. That's if we could all walk that tightrope, it would be really, really good.
So you spoke about taking out dairy or gluten from your diet, but what sort of risks are there for athletes that are vegetarian?
Listen, I think vegetarian athletes can be very healthy. They tend to have, really good variety, particularly with fruit and veg, and obviously with fiber-based foods or legumes and whatever. So there's absolutely a vegetarian athlete can be an exceptionally healthy athlete. I think what they require maybe is a little bit more planning in terms of, how they go about putting their diet together. A lot of vegetarians I know are exceptionally good cooks, and they really like to cook as well. But I think we need to just be careful. Let's say, for example, if you're going to competition or you're training quite a bit out of the house where you may not have as much access, that will require a little bit more preparation. In terms of protein intake, which is often a question, protein has animal sources, but it also has a lot of vegetarian sources as well. So that will be our beans, peas, lentils, those types of proteins. And we can also, for example, in oats, you will get protein. In some of our other cereals, we'll get protein as well. It's just, we'll need a lot of variety there so that you can get a good mix of all the different amino acids and proteins that there are. So it's more about making sure there's good variety there. The other thing, and I suppose that comes back to some of the questions we answered a while back, is that fiber will fill you up quite a bit. So what the biggest risk I can see for a vegetarian athlete is that they could underfuel, not knowingly, but because they actually have consumed quite a lot of food, but it's actually very nutrient dense, but energy poor. So that would be the key thing, is making sure that you're meeting your energy requirements, because you're more than likely going to meet your nutrient requirements for all of the micronutrients and fiber, but you could be a little bit short when it comes to adding up the calories. That's why fiber is so good, because it fills people up and they don't actually eat. And that's why it's so good for the general population, because they're generally not doing enough or doing a lot of activity relative to athletes. So therefore, the key thing for them is to give them lots on their plate, but it costs very few calories. Whereas with an athlete, you have to have, you need to make sure that there's lots of calories in there sometimes. And sometimes the lots on the plate is tricky, because if you think about it, some exercise will cut that appetite. So if you have that there, plus you're not eating enough, you could see why sometimes that could be risky for some people.
Well, I was going to finish with asking, what would be your advice to people in general right now in their interesting situations we find ourselves in? That probably is the advice you would give them.
I think like food and mood go together quite a lot, either in a good way or not so good way. So you have individuals that, whenever maybe they're anxious or stressed or in bad form, they will eat everything in front of them. And then you've actually got the other group of individuals who it has a serious effect on appetite loss. Try and stick with routine. It's really, really important. I think be conscious that the fridge is very close at hand. And, if that's your go-to place, really do try and take steps maybe away from the fridge. And it is about those urges will pass. So when somebody does feel like having something, whether it's a craving or they want to go to the fridge, it's generally through boredom or it's an urge. And what you find is that those urges do pass after maybe 30, 40 seconds, but you've got to do something to get yourself through that period of time, whether that's literally going outside, walking around the house and coming back in, or making sure that, you have something to occupy your mind whenever you're finding that way as well. I also think that not eating at night tends to be a tricky situation for people as well. They're maybe going to bed later, getting up later. So it is important to have a think about, what you're eating earlier in the day so that you're not hungry at night as well, because that does have a big impact. You're less likely to make better choices at night than you would during, earlier in the day. But I think part of that is maybe people are switching their eating patterns and eating later at night and then not feeling like eating anything in the morning either. So just try to stick with your routine as much as you can. Listen, sometimes that will not work, but don't beat yourself up about it, because again, people get racked with guilt, and then what happens is then that predisposes them then to binge a little bit again. So if you have a bad day, you have a bad day, forget about it, let it go and move on.
Yeah, it's great advice, Sharon. And like you're saying, if you have a bad day, and normally healthy people are even falling foul of just completely random diets at the moment. I would normally always have porridge for breakfast, but I think, and I'm not afraid to admit this, a couple of days last week I had biscuits for breakfast, and it's just a case of you get up feeling like you're sort of losing the will to live in these restrictions, and then you think, oh, I'll just eat a biscuit, and it does make it better for a while.
Yeah, and listen, it's not going to kill you, but I think what will actually be worse is the guilt that you might feel for a long period of time after that. That actually causes more stress in the longer term. So, if you've done that, that's okay. Move on from it. And again, I think remember the adage of if 80% of the time you're doing the right thing, then 20% of the time is okay to do whatever. I think it's just, if you think about, we're in the house almost 100% of the time now. That is just so unlike what we would do normally. And I think if you went out and had a coffee and something in a coffee shop, you probably wouldn't feel that guilty about that. But because that 20% of the time is feeling a lot more, at the moment we're probably feeling that we're doing things that maybe we shouldn't be doing much more, but we're probably not in the big scheme of things.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sharon. If you'll excuse the pun, it is food for thought for plenty of young athletes, including male athletes and coaches as well. It's about time for both of us, though, to get outside and get a little bit of vitamin D. But everybody join us again for another episode of #WePlay2020.